Imagine stepping into the great halls of Tudor England in the early 16th century. Flickering candlelight bounces off gilded tapestries, the air heavy with incense. And at the center of it all, a man whose appetite for glory, power, and love would change not just his kingdom, but the very course of European history. That man was Henry VIII. That when most people hear his name, one phrase immediately follows: the king with six wives. It is a title that has defined him for centuries. But these marriages were not merely tales of passion or betrayal. They were battles fought on the fields of politics, religion, and legacy. Each wife was more than just a footnote. She was a woman with her own story, her own hopes and fears, her own mark on history. The Tudor dynasty itself was fragile. Henry's father, Henry VII, had won the throne through conquest after the Bloody Wars of the Roses, a conflict that had ripped England apart. When young Henry VIII ascended to the throne in 1509, he was not merely a monarch. He was the embodiment of a nation desperate for stability. Handsome, athletic, and intelligent, Henry was hailed as the Golden Prince. But beneath the shine of this new reign lay an obsession that would haunt him. The desperate need for a male heir to secure the Tudor line. It was this obsession, more than any other desire, that would dictate the fates of six women and forever alter the landscape of England. Each wife, whether queen or briefly consort, would become entangled in Henry's relentless pursuit of dynasty. Their stories intertwine love, betrayal, survival, and sacrifice. They lived under the shadow of a king whose love could elevate them to dazzling heights, and whose wrath could end in tragedy. But to understand why these women mattered, we must first understand Henry himself. He was not always the tyrant of legend. As a young man, Henry was charming, deeply religious, a lover of music and justs, a patron of humanist learning. Europe looked upon him as a Renaissance king destined for greatness. Yet, as the years passed, his hunger for control and his paranoia over succession grew, twisting him into the man history remembers today. And in that transformation, his wives played central roles. Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who stood by him for 2 decades, only to be cast aside when she could not give him a son. And Boleyn, the captivating courtier whose wit and ambition helped trigger the English Reformation, and whose tragic fall still echoes in popular memory. Jane Seymour, the demure and gentle queen who finally gave Henry the son he craved but paid with her life. And of Cleves, a foreign bride chosen for diplomacy, rejected for her plainness, yet clever enough to survive. Catherine Howard, young and reckless, whose dalliance led to the scaffold. And Catherine Parr, learned and pragmatic, who outlived the king and helped shape the future of his children. 6 women, 6 fates, and one king who bound them together in a legacy of power, love, and betrayal. This story is not merely about a tyrant's whims. It is about how the personal lives of rulers could ignite wars, topple churches, and redefine nations. Henry's search for love and legitimacy tore England away from the Catholic Church, established the Church of England, and set the stage for centuries of conflict and reform. The choices he made in the bedchamber reverberated in the throne room, the pulpit, and the battlefield. As we journey through their stories, we will not only see queens adorned in velvet and jewels, but also women trapped in gilded cages. We will walk with them through the grandeur of coronations and the terror of executions, through whispered courtly intrigues and the silent prayers of lonely chambers. These women were not passive victims. They were players in a dangerous game, where survival often meant compromise, silence, or sacrifice. So let us step back to the year 1509, when a young king, not yet burdened by age or tyranny, placed a crown upon his head and promised his people glory. At his side stood his first queen, a woman of royal Spanish blood, whose fate would mark the beginning of this extraordinary saga. The story begins with Catherine of Aragon. When Henry VIII first ascended the throne in 1509, he did not stand alone. At his side was a woman whose presence embodied both dynastic strength and international diplomacy, Catherine of Aragon. Born in 1485, Catherine was the youngest daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Her upbringing was steeped in both piety and politics. She was educated rigorously, fluent in Latin, and trained to be both a devout Christian and a shrewd queen. That Catherine's destiny was tied to England long before Henry came into the picture. At the tender age of 16, she was married to Henry's elder brother, Prince Arthur. Their union was designed to cement the alliance between Spain and England, two kingdoms eager to fortify themselves against France. Yet tragedy struck swiftly. Just months into the marriage, Arthur fell ill and died, leaving Catherine a widow in a foreign land. For years, Catherine remained in England in an uncomfortable limbo. Questions arose. Should she return to Spain? Should she remarry? Diplomatic maneuvering kept her tethered to the English court. Ultimately, she was betrothed to Henry, then a young prince of 10. But such unions required not only political will, but also papal approval, as marrying a deceased brother's widow fell under canon law. Catherine insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, paving the way for the Pope to grant dispensation. When Henry and Catherine finally married in June 1509, theirs was a union celebrated by the English people. The young king and his Spanish bride were hailed as a golden couple. He, handsome and vigorous; she, regal and devout. Together, they represented hope for a new era of prosperity and stability. For 2 decades, Catherine fulfilled her duties with unwavering loyalty. She stood as queen consort, presided over a glittering court, and supported her husband's ambitions. That Catherine's greatest triumph came in 1513, when Henry was away campaigning in France. Left as regent, she oversaw the kingdom's defense against the Scots. At the Battle of Flodden, English forces crushed their northern enemies, and Catherine sent Henry the bloodied coat of the slain Scottish king, James IV, as a token of victory. It was a moment that showcased her strength and her ability to rule in her husband's absence. Yet, despite her devotion, Catherine's marriage was plagued by one central issue: the failure to produce a surviving male heir. Catherine endured numerous pregnancies, many ending in miscarriage or stillbirth. Only one child, Princess Mary, survived into adulthood. For Henry, this was not enough. He believed England's stability rested on a male successor, and as the years passed, his desperation grew. Catherine, deeply pious, believed her trials were the will of God. She remained steadfast in her role, refusing to yield her position or diminish her devotion to Henry. But as Henry's eye began to wander, most notably to a young lady-in-waiting named Boleyn, the queen found herself pushed into the shadows. Henry's desire for and coincided with his mounting frustration over his lack of a son. He became convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, that marrying his brother's widow had brought divine disfavor. Seeking an annulment, Henry petitioned the Pope to declare his marriage invalid. But Catherine refused to concede. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and she would not allow herself or her daughter Mary to be declared illegitimate. The battle that ensued was not merely marital. It became a war of politics and faith. Catherine stood her ground, appealing not only to her people, many of whom adored her, but also to her powerful Spanish relatives and the Catholic Church. She argued eloquently in court, declaring, "I have been to you a true wife, humble and obedient. I have loved you and kept you my husband against all dangers." But Henry's will was iron. When the Pope refused to grant the annulment, Henry broke with Rome entirely, establishing the Church of England with himself as supreme head. This seismic shift in religious authority, the English Reformation, was born out of Henry's desperation to rid himself of Catherine. In 1533, Henry declared his marriage to Catherine invalid and wed Boleyn. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen, relegated to the lesser designation of Dowager Princess of Wales, the title she had once held as Arthur's widow. She was banished from court, separated from her beloved daughter Mary, and left to live in isolation. Catherine of Aragon died in 1536, steadfast in her faith and unwavering in her claim that she was Henry's true wife until the end. Her epitaph could have read not of defeat, but of endurance. She was a queen who, despite betrayal and humiliation, remained dignified and resolute. Her story set the stage for the tumultuous saga that would follow, as Henry's quest for love and legacy grew ever more perilous. The curtain now rises on Boleyn, the woman whose allure and ambition would change the fate of England forever. When Boleyn first arrived at the English court, she did not immediately appear as a queen-in-waiting. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who carried the aura of continental royalty and was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a member of the aristocratic Howard family, educated in the Netherlands and later at the French court, and was polished, sophisticated, and deeply influenced by the culture of Renaissance Europe. She was not the most conventionally beautiful woman of her time, but she possessed something far more dangerous: wit, charm, and ambition at first, and served as a lady-in-waiting, a position that often meant invisibility. Yet she quickly drew attention, not only for her fashion and intelligence, but for her refusal to play by the ordinary rules of courtly love. When Henry VIII set his sights on her and did not succumb easily, she resisted his advances, refusing to become merely his mistress. In doing so, she ignited a desire in Henry that soon consumed both of them, that Henry's passion for and coincided with his growing dissatisfaction with Catherine of Aragon. Convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, Henry saw and not just as an object of desire, but as a solution, a new wife who might finally give him the male heir he so desperately craved. Anne's refusal to yield to Henry's advances until he made her queen turned what might have been an affair into a revolution. Henry fought to annul his marriage to Catherine. Anne's influence over him grew. She encouraged him to challenge papal authority, to consider the possibility of establishing himself as the head of the church in England. Together, they became symbols of change, their union representing not just passion but defiance against Rome. Anne's rise to power was meteoric, and with it came enemies at every corner of the court. In 1533, Henry and Anne were secretly married, even before Catherine's fate was sealed, and was crowned queen in a grand ceremony, her triumph dazzling but precarious. For a time, she basked in the king's favor, showered with titles, riches, and influence. She was no longer the lady-in-waiting. She was the second queen of England, a woman who had shaken the foundations of the Catholic Church itself. But Anne's greatest test lay ahead, producing an heir. In September 1533, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Though disappointed, Henry remained hopeful. Yet, as the years passed and suffered miscarriages and failed pregnancies, each one a devastating blow, Henry's frustration grew, and the passion that once bound them began to fray. And was not a silent queen. She was outspoken, politically savvy, and unafraid to voice her opinions. She championed reformist religious ideas, protected scholars, and influenced the direction of England's break from Rome. But her boldness, admired by some, infuriated others. At court, she was seen as haughty, manipulative, even a witch who had bewitched the king. The very qualities that elevated her now painted her as dangerous. By the mid-1530s, Anne's enemies circled. Henry's eye had wandered again, this time toward Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. For Anne, the pattern was all too familiar. The same fate that had befallen Catherine now loomed over her. But Anne's fall would come far more swiftly and brutally. In 1536, charges of adultery, incest, and treason were brought against her. Historians continue to debate the truth of these accusations. Many argue they were fabricated, the result of political maneuvering by Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had once been her ally. Regardless of the truth, Anne's fate was sealed. After a sensational trial, she was found guilty on May 19, 1536, and Boleyn was executed by a French swordsman on Tower Green. She met her end with remarkable composure, declaring her loyalty to the king and praying for his well-being. Her final words echoed not bitterness but grace, a striking contrast to the fury that had defined her downfall. Anne's legacy endures not just in the shadow of her tragic death, but in her daughter, Elizabeth, who would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. The woman condemned as ambitious and dangerous would, through her bloodline, give England its golden age, and Boleyn dared too much, reached too high, and paid the ultimate price. But her story was far from the end of Henry's tumultuous marital saga. Already, another woman waited in the wings, ready to fulfill the king's most desperate dream, the gift of a son. That woman was Jane Seymour. As the axe fell on Boleyn in May 1536, Henry VIII was already turning his eyes toward his next bride. Waiting quietly in the wings was Jane Seymour, a woman who seemed to be the very opposite of and demure, obedient, and unassuming. Where Anne had been fiery and outspoken, Jane appeared gentle and submissive. Yet beneath this exterior lay the determination and poise of a woman who would secure her place in Tudor history, not through passion, but through motherhood. Jane was the daughter of Sir John Seymour, a respected country squire of Wolf Hall, and she had served as a lady-in-waiting first to Catherine of Aragon and later to Anne Boleyn. Though not as worldly or educated as her predecessors, Jane embodied the virtues most prized in a traditional Tudor woman: modesty, piety, and quiet strength. She knew well the lessons of Catherine and Anne, that to survive as Henry's wife, one had to balance obedience with just enough influence to remain indispensable. Henry was immediately captivated by Jane's calm demeanor. In her, he saw not only a respite from Anne's tempestuous reign, but also the possibility of the one thing he desired above all else: a legitimate male heir. Jane did not resist the king's advances as Anne once had. Instead, she carefully presented herself as the devoted servant, the woman ready to heal the wounds of a restless king. Just days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. Their marriage followed swiftly on May 30th, 1536. The contrast between Anne's bloody fall and Jane's quiet rise could not have been sharper. For many, Jane's presence symbolized reconciliation, a return to order after years of turmoil. As queen, Jane did not seek to dominate the court with bold reforms or personal ambition. Instead, she played the role of peacemaker. She worked to mend the fractured relationship between Henry and his eldest daughter, Mary, who had been declared illegitimate after Catherine of Aragon's fall. Jane's gentle intercession helped restore Mary to some favor, though the scars of her father's rejection never truly healed. But Jane's true legacy would not be her diplomacy. It would be her ability to provide what Catherine and Anne could not. In the summer of 1537, Jane became pregnant. The entire court held its breath, for everything: Henry's dynasty, his authority, even his sense of destiny, depended on the outcome. At last, on October 12th, 1537, Jane gave birth to a healthy boy, Edward. Bells rang across England, fires were lit in celebration, and Henry, now 46 years old, wept tears of joy. His obsession, the quest that had cost two queens their crowns and won her life, had finally been fulfilled. Edward was christened in a magnificent ceremony, with his sisters Mary and Elizabeth present, though still labeled illegitimate by law. For a brief moment, Henry's world seemed whole. He now had the heir that secured the Tudor dynasty. Yet the triumph came at a devastating cost. The birth had been difficult, and Jane's health declined rapidly in the days that followed. Despite the efforts of physicians, she grew weaker and weaker. On October 24th, just 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour died of postnatal complications. She was only around 29 years old. Henry was inconsolable. Of all his 6 wives, Jane would be remembered as the one he truly mourned. Unlike Catherine and Anne, Jane had given him what he desired most. Her death struck him deeply, and he ordered that she be buried with honor at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Years later, when Henry himself died, he chose to be interred beside her, a testament to the unique place she held in his heart. Jane Seymour's legacy was short-lived but profound. Through her, the Tudor line gained its much-needed heir. Edward would ascend the throne as Edward VI, though his reign was tragically brief. Jane's memory endured as the gentle queen who succeeded where others had failed, though the price she paid was her own life. But even as Henry mourned, the machinery of politics and diplomacy pressed on. England needed alliances, and Henry's restless heart sought companionship once again. The next chapter of his marital saga would be unlike the others, not driven by passion or personal choice, but by the necessities of statecraft. The bride would be Anne of Cleves. In the wake of Jane Seymour's death, Henry VIII was left both triumphant and bereaved. He finally had the male heir he longed for, yet he had lost the wife who delivered him. For 2 years, Henry remained unmarried, mourning Jane, but political necessity soon drove him back to the altar. The shifting tides of European politics demanded new alliances, and Henry's advisors urged him to look abroad for a bride who could strengthen England's position against the Catholic powers of France and Spain. The choice fell upon Anne of Cleves, a German princess from the Duchy of Cleves, part of the powerful Protestant alliance in Northern Europe. The match promised to bolster England's ties with the Protestant states, creating a counterweight to the Catholic monarchs who eyed Henry with suspicion after his break from Rome. On paper, it was a brilliant diplomatic strategy. In reality, it would become one of the most infamous missteps of Henry's reign. Anne of Cleves was raised in a modest court, far removed from the glamour and sophistication of France or Spain. She was not highly educated, nor was she skilled in music or courtly refinement, but she was considered virtuous, gentle, and obedient, the qualities of a suitable queen. To secure Henry's approval, a renowned artist, Hans Holbein the Younger, was dispatched to paint her portrait. The likeness pleased Henry enough to agree to the marriage, though the accuracy of Holbein's work would soon be questioned. When Anne arrived in England in late 1539, Henry eagerly went to meet her in disguise, as was the custom of courtly romance. But the meeting was a disaster. Henry, who prided himself on his charm, expected Anne to be smitten. Instead, she barely acknowledged him, unaware that the burly stranger before her was the king himself. Henry was mortified. Upon seeing her in full, he declared that he had been misled by the flattering portrait, and, he said, was nothing like the vision Holbein had painted. Despite Henry's disappointment, the wheels of diplomacy could not be stopped. On January 6, 1540, Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII were married. The ceremony was grand, but the marriage was doomed from the start. Henry confided to his advisors that he found his new bride physically repulsive, referring to her unkindly as a Flanders mare. Their union was never consummated, and Henry's frustration grew by the day, and, however, bore the humiliation with dignity. She was far from the conniving or ambitious type. She accepted her fate with quiet resilience. Within 6 months, Henry sought a way out. Conveniently, the political alliance with Cleves had already begun to crumble, lessening the diplomatic need for the match. The marriage was annulled in July 1540 on the grounds of non-consummation, and Anne's pre-contract with another nobleman that, in a surprising twist, and emerged not as a victim, but as a survivor. She acquiesced to the annulment, showing no resistance, and in return, Henry rewarded her with a generous settlement. She was granted estates, a lavish household, and the honorary title of the king's sister. Unlike Catherine of Aragon or Boleyn, Anne of Cleves maintained a cordial relationship with Henry even after their marriage ended. She was welcomed at court, enjoyed a comfortable life in England, and remained on good terms with Henry's children. That Anne's pragmatism spared her the fate of so many of Henry's other wives. She lived through the remainder of his reign and outlived him by nearly a decade, passing away peacefully in 1557. Her story stands as a rare tale of survival in a narrative otherwise marked by betrayal and bloodshed. But while Anne of Cleves faded into relative contentment, Henry's restless search for love and fulfillment was far from over. His next queen would be young, impulsive, and tragically ill-prepared for the treacherous world of Tudor politics. Her charm captivated the aging king, but her reckless heart would lead her to ruin. The stage was set for Catherine Howard. Anne of Cleves was the queen who survived by yielding with grace. Catherine Howard was the queen who fell by yielding too much to youthful folly. Her story is one of innocence tainted by ambition, charm undone by recklessness, and a tragic reminder of how perilous it was to be Henry VIII's wife. Catherine Howard was born around 1523, the daughter of a lesser branch of the powerful Howard family. Her upbringing was far from regal. After her father fell into debt and disgrace, Catherine was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. It was a chaotic environment, poorly supervised, where young girls mingled freely with older men. In this permissive atmosphere, Catherine engaged in youthful flirtations and indiscretions, secrets that would later seal her fate. In her teenage years, Catherine was brought to court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. There, her beauty and vivacious spirit quickly drew attention. Catherine was everything and was not. Young, radiant, and full of life. For the aging Henry VIII, now overweight, plagued with ulcers, and increasingly paranoid, Catherine was like a vision of youth reborn. She embodied vitality, a balm to soothe his weary pride. Henry was enchanted. Showering her with jewels, gowns, and affection, he soon elevated her to the status of queen. In July 1540, mere weeks after annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry wed Catherine Howard. She was likely no older than 17. He was nearly 50 at first. The union seemed to rejuvenate the king. Catherine became known at court as the Rose without a thorn, admired for her beauty and charm. She danced, laughed, and flattered Henry, restoring some sparkle to his troubled reign. But Catherine's youth was both her allure and her downfall. She lacked the political shrewdness of Catherine of Aragon, the cunning of Boleyn, or the gentleness of Seymour. She was carefree in a world where every whisper could mean life or death. Soon, rumors began to swirl. Catherine's past indiscretions with men before her marriage came to light, whispered by jealous courtiers and enemies of her Howard kin. Worse still, she began an ill-fated affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. Whether driven by passion, loneliness, or recklessness, her secret meetings with Culpeper sealed her doom. In 1541, evidence of Catherine's infidelity reached Henry. At first, the king refused to believe it. He adored his young queen, and the revelation shattered him. But when proof mounted, letters, confessions, testimonies, his grief turned to fury. Henry was said to have wept openly, lamenting that he had been so deceived. Catherine was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Unlike in Boleyn, who had faced her end with composure, Catherine was terrified. Barely more than a girl, she begged for mercy, pleading to see the king, but Henry refused. On February 13, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed. She was no older than 19. Her final words, according to some accounts, were a sorrowful acknowledgement of her mistakes. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Whether these words are apocryphal or not, they capture the essence of her tragedy. A young woman caught between the intoxicating heights of power and the fatal pull of forbidden love, that Catherine's fall shook the court. The Howard family was disgraced, and Henry was left once again bereft, his heart hardened by betrayal. Yet even in his bitterness, the king did not abandon the search for companionship. He would marry once more, not for passion or alliance, but for stability and care in his declining years. The woman who would become his sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr, a widow twice over, intelligent, compassionate, and strong enough to survive where others had perished. By the time Henry VIII set his eyes on Catherine Parr, he was no longer the golden prince who had once dazzled Europe. He was a man in decline, obese, plagued by gout and leg ulcers, and embittered by the betrayals and failures of his past marriages. Yet even in his twilight years, Henry craved companionship, loyalty, and the reassurance of a partner who could bring stability to both his personal life and his fractured kingdom. Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, would prove to be exactly that. Catherine Parr was born in 1512, the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal and Maud Green, both loyal servants of the Tudor crown. Unlike many of Henry's other wives, Catherine had not been groomed from youth for queenship. She was married twice before meeting the king, both times to older men. Widowed by the age of 31, she was seasoned by experience, pragmatic, and deeply pious. These qualities prepared her uniquely for the perilous role of Henry's queen. That Catherine's path to the throne was not driven by ambition, but by circumstance. In fact, before Henry courted her, she had been in love with another man, Thomas Seymour, the brother of Henry's third wife, Jane. Their romance was cut short when the king expressed his intention to marry her. Catherine, pragmatic as ever, set aside her personal desires and accepted her duty, recognizing that refusal could be dangerous, if not fatal. In July 1543, Catherine Parr became the Queen of England. Unlike her predecessors, she was not defined by youthful allure or political maneuvering, but by her intellect and compassion. Catherine was highly educated for a woman of her time, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply engaged with the religious debates of the day. She was a supporter of the Protestant Reformation and authored books of prayer and devotion, making her the first Queen of England to publish under her own name. That Catherine's greatest achievement as queen lay not in bearing children, though she had none with Henry, but in uniting his fractured family. She played the role of peacemaker, working tirelessly to reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had been declared illegitimate at different points. Through her influence, both girls were restored to the line of succession, ensuring their future claims to the throne. Without Catherine's intervention, the course of English history and the reign of Elizabeth I might have been very different, yet Catherine's intelligence and reformist sympathies nearly brought her down. In 1546, conservative factions at court, alarmed by her Protestant leanings, accused her of heresy and sought to undermine her. Even Henry, influenced by whispers of disloyalty, briefly signed a warrant for her arrest. But Catherine, demonstrating her remarkable wit and survival instinct, managed to defuse the situation. She humbly declared that her religious discussions were meant only to distract the king from his suffering, not to challenge his authority. Flattered, Henry forgave her, and the warrant was never executed. Through her tact and resilience, Catherine Parr achieved what none of Henry's other wives had. She outlived him. When Henry died in January 1547, she was left a wealthy widow once again, free at last to pursue her own desires. She married her former love, Thomas Seymour, though the union would prove tumultuous. Tragically, Catherine Parr died in 1548, shortly after giving birth to her only child, a daughter named Mary Seymour. She was 36 years old. Catherine Parr's legacy endures as that of the survivor queen. She was not the most dramatic figure in Henry's marital saga, but she was perhaps the most consequential. By ensuring the legitimacy of Mary and Elizabeth, she safeguarded the future of the Tudor dynasty. By promoting religious reform, she helped set the stage for England's transformation under her stepdaughter Elizabeth. And by surviving Henry himself, she proved that wisdom, patience, and resilience could triumph where beauty, passion, or ambition had failed. With Catherine Parr's story, the saga of Henry VIII's 6 wives reaches its conclusion. Yet the impact of their lives and their deaths was far from over. Each marriage had left its mark on the kingdom, reshaping politics, religion, and society. Together, these 6 women defined not only the reign of one king, but also the destiny of a nation. But the tale does not end with them. To understand the true weight of their legacy, we must step back and examine the consequences of Henry's choices, the seismic shifts in faith, power, and culture that reverberated long after his death. The story of Henry VIII's 6 wives is not merely a tale of personal passion and betrayal. It is the story of how one man's quest for love, power, and an heir reshaped an entire kingdom. Each marriage was more than a private union. It was a political act, a religious gamble, and a cultural turning point. When we look back at the lives of Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, we see not just 6 women, but 6 catalysts of history. The most profound legacy of Henry's marriages was the English Reformation. His desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and the Pope's refusal to grant it, led Henry to break from the Roman Catholic Church and establish the Church of England with himself as supreme head. This seismic shift not only transformed religion in England, but also weakened papal authority across Europe. The monasteries were dissolved, lands and wealth were seized, and centuries of Catholic tradition were uprooted. The ripple effects of this decision shaped English society for generations, sparking conflicts, persecutions, and eventually, new forms of faith, and Boleyn's story was inseparable from this transformation. Her marriage to Henry was the spark that ignited the break with Rome. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would later ascend the throne and establish Protestantism as the bedrock of England, ushering in the Elizabethan Golden Age. Though Anne's life ended in tragedy, her bloodline carried the future of the Tudor dynasty. Jane Seymour's brief queenship brought the long-sought male heir, Edward VI, whose reign entrenched Protestant reforms even further. Yet Edward's fragile health and early death plunged the nation back into uncertainty, highlighting the very fragility of dynasties that Henry had sought to avoid. And if Cleves' marriage may have been short and humiliating, but it demonstrated the increasing role of diplomacy in Henry's later reign. Her survival also proved that compliance and pragmatism could achieve what beauty and ambition could not: safety in a dangerous court. Catherine Howard's downfall was a cautionary tale of youth and recklessness, but it also revealed the culture of surveillance and intrigue that had grown in Henry's court. Her execution was another stain on Henry's reign, reinforcing his reputation as a king whose wrath was swift and merciless. Finally, Catherine Parr's survival was perhaps the most consequential of all. She not only safeguarded the futures of Mary and Elizabeth, but also promoted learning, faith, and reform. Her efforts helped ensure that the Tudor dynasty would continue through the reigns of Henry's children, each of whom left a distinct mark on England's history. Beyond politics and religion, the saga of Henry's 6 wives altered the very culture of monarchy. It exposed the dangers of tying dynastic survival to the whims of one man's desires. It revealed the vulnerability of Queen's consort, who could be exalted or destroyed by forces far beyond their control. And it left England with a legacy of strong, resilient women. Women who endured humiliation, betrayal, and even death, yet whose stories still echo across the centuries. For the people of Tudor England, these events were not abstract. They experienced the closure of monasteries, the banning of Catholic practices, the fear of executions, and the uncertainty of shifting allegiances. Ordinary lives were shaken as profoundly as royal ones. Farmers found their lands changed hands, priests found themselves outlawed, and families faced new expectations of faith. The personal choices of Henry VIII reverberated through every parish and household in the land. The saga of the 6 wives is therefore not just about one king's love life. It is about the forging of modern England. It is about how personal ambition and private desire can ignite revolutions and reshape nations. And it is about the enduring power of women's voices, even when silenced by scaffold or exile. As we close in on the end of this story, one question remains: what does it all mean today? Why do the lives of 6 women, bound to a single king 5 centuries ago, continue to fascinate us? To answer that, we must step into the final chapter, an outro that reflects on love, power, and betrayal, and why these themes still resonate with us now. The saga of Henry VIII and his 6 wives is one of the most enduring stories in history, a tale that blends the personal and the political, the intimate and the monumental. It is a story of power, how one king's obsession with control, lineage, and legacy could reshape an entire nation. It is a story of love, desires fulfilled and unfulfilled, passions that flared brightly only to be extinguished by cruelty or fate. And above all, it is a story of betrayal, of vows broken, hearts deceived, and lives destroyed in the pursuit of one man's will. As we reflect on Catherine of Aragon's steadfast loyalty and Boleyn's daring ambition, Jane Seymour's quiet triumph, and of Cleves' graceful survival, Catherine Howard's tragic folly, and Catherine Parr's wise resilience. We see six women who were more than mere figures in Henry's shadow. They were daughters, lovers, mothers, dreamers, and survivors. Each, in her own way, shaped not only Henry's reign, but the future of England itself. The lessons of their lives still resonate. Catherine of Aragon's story reminds us of the strength found in dignity, even in defeat. And Boleyn's fate warns us of the dangers of ambition unchecked by caution. Yet her legacy endures in the form of Elizabeth I. Jane Seymour shows that even brief moments of influence can alter dynastic destiny. And of Cleves proves that survival sometimes lies in surrendering pride. Catherine Howard illustrates the peril of innocence unguarded in a world of predators. And Catherine Parr reveals the quiet power of wisdom, patience, and compassion. Beyond their individual stories, the six wives together symbolize the complexity of power in human relationships. They remind us that history is not only written by kings and generals, but also by women whose lives, often cut short or silenced, nevertheless shaped the world we inherit today. Why do we remain fascinated by this tale 5 centuries later? Perhaps because it is, at its core, a deeply human story. We recognize in Henry's obsession the universal fear of mortality and the longing for legacy. We see in the wives' struggles echoes of our own, desires for love, dignity, survival, and meaning. And we find in their fates timeless questions. How much power does love hold? When does devotion become betrayal? And how far should one go in pursuit of survival? The Tudor court is long gone, but its echoes linger. The palaces where queens once walked are now museums. The Tower of London, wherein Boleyn and Catherine Howard met their end, stands as a silent witness to ambition and tragedy. And the stories of these six women live on in books, plays, films, and the collective imagination, reminding us that their struggles are not so distant from our OWI in the end. The wives of Henry VIII were more than pawns in a king's game. They were queens whose lives, loves, and losses continue to speak across time. Their saga tells us that history is never just about power, it is about people. And it asks us to consider, when love, ambition, and betrayal collide, what legacy do we leave behind? Perhaps that is why this story endures. Because even now, centuries later, it forces us to ask not just about Henry and his wives, but about ourselves. What will we sacrifice for power? What risks will we take for love? And how would we face betrayal when it comes? The answers lie not only in the past, but in the choices we make today.